Hey, I'm Jamie from Stonemaier Games, and today I'm going to talk about my top 10 favorite games with pivotal tipping points. This is a topic I've been wanting to talk about for a while. I don't really know why I haven't discussed it earlier, because it is a part of games that I really love. I love timing and order of operations in games, and timing is a huge part of these pivotal tipping points. So what I'm talking about here are games where there's a distinct shift chosen by each player. So not determined by the game itself, but chosen by the players when players stop improving their engine or their potential and they start pushing towards the victory condition. I'll share some classic examples of this in the top 10 video in a second. Another version of this that came up as I was polling people about it are games where there are smaller buildups throughout the game, where you're building up to something and then having it pay off, and kind of deciding in these games how much are you going to build up to get the payoff at the end of it. And many of these games have incremental and even exponential payoffs, depending on how much time and investment you spend building up. I know I'm talking about this in a very vague way, but it'll make more sense in a second if you can't already think of some examples. So some ambassador and live stream viewer picks were Seven Wonders, Architects of the West Kingdom, Ark Nova, Clank, Dominion, Earth, Food Chain Magnate, For Sale, Gizmos, Wingspan, Rogers of the Ganges, Scythe, Space Base, Tapestry, Terraforming Mars, Honeybuzz, Champions in Midgard, and Darwin's Journey. I probably could have done a top 15 list for this, but I did whittle it down to 10 based on various factors. But I love all the games on what would have been my top 15 list. So my honorable mentions are Honeybuzz. In Honeybuzz, you are kind of building up these honeycombs, and when you complete the honeycomb, you get a benefit. And in Honeybuzz, you can decide if you want to make an easier easier honeycomb that has less of a payoff, or really focus on getting as many different tiles into that honeycomb to get a bigger payoff. Splendor is a game where you're building an engine, you're acquiring these cards that give you gems for the rest of the game that you can use to spend. And I think the pivotal tipping point in Splendor is deciding when to stop focusing on the low point cards and to start focusing on the high point cards that still build your engine. Then there's For Sale and Lost Ruins of Arnak. And I'm grouping these together because I feel like both of these games are games where the game almost tells you when the tipping point happens rather than you deciding when it happens. For Sale, it's literally like the first half of the game is building up, and the second half of the game is using what you built to you're buying houses and then you're selling those houses for the second half of the game. And Lost Ruins of Arnak, the game kind of staggers the buildup in terms of the items that are available for you to acquire versus the number of artifacts that are available for you to acquire. And by the end of the game, there's only one item for you to acquire, and there's tons of artifacts. So the game is kind of determining that pace for you. And Seven Wonders almost made the list, but I also felt that Seven Wonders, based on the cards that are available in each era of Seven Wonders, the game is essentially, again, telling you which cards you can use to actually build up and which cards at certain points of the game are just available for you to have the payoff. In the last era of a game of Seven Wonders, you don't have any cards anymore that let you build up. They're purely payoff cards in the last era. So well-designed approach to it there, but it doesn't give players the freedom to decide when they're going to switch over from build up to payoff. So my top 10 list, I'm going to start off with some Stonemaier games because many of our games have this element. Most of our games are built around progression and engine building with timing elements built into them. When do you decide to pay off? Wingspan does this in terms of how much do you build up a row before you actually use that row, and how much do you build up your engine before you just really start to focus on points. In Scythe, there is a couple different ways that Scythe builds up, but in Scythe, you are deciding for most of your actions that you're upgrading or deciding to upgrade how lucrative you want to make that action in terms of coins before you start to use that bottom row action. So like if you can potentially get a bunch of coins from the deploy action, do you take that deploy action early because you want it, or do you wait until you've made it really cheap and really lucrative to take that action and then get a bigger payoff when you actually start using it? And Tapestry is largely a game about timing as you're building your civilization. The game inherently pushes you towards building up. As you advance on the tracks, you are just inherently moving towards bigger payoffs. But the timing of some of those payoffs and really matters in Tapestry. They're bigger payoffs if you time the advancement on one track with the advancement on other tracks. In Apiary, one of my favorite buildups in Apiary are the carving tiles. So when you place a carving tile, sometimes it's either a spatial element or just the number of other certain tiles that you have in your tableau will have an immediate payoff, or not an immediate payoff, but it will determine the value of that tile at the end of the game. So you're kind of building up to decide when is the time for me to acquire this carving tile that may not be available later. And then last, the visual I have here is of our newest game, Wyrmspan. Wyrmspan has that element of Wingspan in which you are deciding throughout the game, am I going to spend my turn to play a dragon card or entice another dragon card into my tableau? Or is it time for me to explore and move my adventurer meeple along this tableau to gain the benefits, at least of the dragons? You can't move into the caves until you put a dragon there. And it's a two-part benefit because not only are you gaining the if activated benefits on the dragons, but you're also gaining the benefits that the path leads you to. So after you have played this dragon, you have access to this benefit. After you've played this dragon, you have access to this benefit. So the game is always asking you, how much further do you want to push in this row, playing more and more caves and dragons in this row before you actually use it to get the bigger payoff. And it also has, like Wingspan, the decision in the game of when are you going to focus more on points versus more on your progression and your engine building. So I've selected all these games, but in particular Wyrmspan, partially because it's our newest game, but partially because it really exemplifies this topic as our number 10, or as my number 10 pick for pivotal tipping points. At number 9, I have a classic example. So this is probably maybe the most classic example of a tipping point in a tabletop game or a modern tabletop game, and that is Dominion. In Dominion, for the first half of the game, typically, and the half is determined by the players. That's what's critical to this video. The first half of the game, you are building up your engine, your deck of these cards. These, I can't remember what they're called in Dominion, but maybe your Dominion cards and your money cards so that you can buy better cards down here. And so that eventually you can afford the provinces because these are the points cards. And that is the tipping point in Dominion. When do you decide I am done building up, or I'm going to stop focusing on building up and getting these engine building, deck building cards, and I'm going to start focusing on gaining the provinces? And the reason this is a tough decision in Dominion is because these provinces go into your deck. And so you have to have a deck that is really strong at the point in time that you decide to go after the provinces, because otherwise you'll be diluting your engine with the provinces themselves. I love this pivotal tipping point in Dominion. It led me to play Dominion dozens of times back in the day. It's been a while since I played it, but I love this tipping point in Dominion. So that's why it's number 9 on my list. And number 8 is a game that I really love. It's higher on some of my other lists, but I didn't know if it was the best example of tipping points, and that is Earth. The main way in Earth that I found myself experiencing the tipping point is that there are many benefits that let you decide, and all the benefits when you activate cards in Earth are optional. When do you decide to use things that would otherwise give you points to give you other things that don't give you points right away, but might give you points in the long run? An example of this are these cards, these composted cards over here. At the end of the game, every card in your compost pile is worth 1 point, but there are a number of cards that say, spend a card from your compost. Let's see if we have an example here. Not that I can see right off the cuff, but many cards that say, if you spend, say, 2 compost cards, you can play a card for free, something like that. So it gives you a benefit that will help you in the long run, but in the short term, you are essentially spending 2 points to do that. And it's also a resource that you're spending to do that. So the tipping points in Earth are related to these resources that are also worth points later in the game. And there's a lot of cards that deal with those types of resources. Do you hold on to them for their points at the end of the game, or do you spend them now on something that will be better for you in the long run? That is the tipping point that I found that I really enjoy in Earth. At number 8 on the list. Space Base. This is a delightful game. I love Space Base. And this is also very much a game about a pivotal tipping point. In Space Base, you are acquiring these cards that upgrade your numbers 1 through 12. And this matters for some dice rolling that happens in the game. A player will roll 2d6 dice, and you get to decide which of those numbers you want to activate on your tableau. Do you activate the sum of those numbers or each number separately based on benefits that you gain on your turn or off your turn? Many of these cards are about getting more resources or improving your essentially it's income. It's we'll call it income. Or gaining points, and that is it's not this icon. Do we have any point icons over here? Yeah, the spaceship icon. This is a points icon. So early on in the game of Space Base, you are trying to get more resources so you can buy better cards, and you're trying to get more resources so that you can improve your engine. And eventually you're trying to get enough resources to start buying cards that either give you points on an ongoing basis or give you these point cards that you can see up in the upper right of this photo, where these cards are just points immediately, but they block this number from then on. So this is a 42 cost card, 42 space bucks. It goes in the 12 slot, so it doesn't block up that precious of a spot. And it's worth 14 points immediately. It's worth so many points. In a game where it's a race to get, I believe, 40 points. So this is a great tipping point to think about. When am I going to really shut off my engine for a particular number by getting one of these cards? And also, when am I going to decide to stop focusing on my engine and start focusing on these points? And one of the things I will say about Space Base and many of these games is that they have incremental ways of getting points throughout the game. You always feel a little bit of that sense of progression towards the end of the game. But for these pivotal tipping point games, there's often a shift between getting 1 point here, 1 point there, and getting a lot of points, trying to really focus on getting a lot of points on your turn instead of none. And I think Space Base does that really well. That's my number 6 pick here. At number 5, I have Century Golem Edition. Century Spice Road, any version of Century would work for this. This is a game where you are acquiring cards for your hand of cards that you use, and these actually aren't good examples. These cards up here in the card row, where you are either gaining certain resources or converting certain resources when you play these cards. So you're either gaining a card in your turn, or you're playing a card to gain these resources, or you are spending resources to gain one of these cards that are worth different points, and even more points if you get one that has a coin associated with it. So in Century, the tipping points are related to when do you decide to stop focusing on improving your hand of cards with these types of cards versus when you start to spend those resources on these cards. And the game helps you out a little bit with this because there's a limit to the number of resources that you can hold. So at certain points in the game, you'll just have a ton of resources and you'll have to decide, do I continue to hold on these resources and convert them into better resources to get better cards? Or do I spend the resources that I have right now just to get a card that is worth some amount of points? An example here would be, do I go after this 12-point card because I have 2 green and 2 pink? Or if I have a way to convert green into pink, do I wait a little bit longer to convert those green into pink to get this 20-point card? This is where the timing and the tipping points really come into Century. How long do you wait to make that conversion before you actually go for it? And part of the tension here, and the great thing about Century, is the tension comes from the other players, not just the timing at the end of the game. You might be worried that another player is going to take this 20-point card before you can get to it. So maybe you just go for the 12-point card and hope you get more cards before other players do before the end of the game. I really like this tipping point and this tension between other players in Century Spice Road. That's why, or Century Golem Edition in this case. That's why it's my number. I feel like I already said 6. This is my number 10, 9, 8, 7. This is my number 6 pick. Space Base was my number 5 pick, or number 7 pick. I'm all over the place with numbers. Here is Architects of the West Kingdom. This is my actual 5th pick, Architects of the West Kingdom. This has a really great tipping point in the game. This is one of these tipping points that happens throughout the game multiple times, and it has to do with where you place your workers. In Architects, on your turn, you are placing 1 worker on an action, and many of these actions just have basic benefits. If you place 1 worker here, you gain, for example, 1, let's see, this one gains you a wood. So this is in the forest, gain a wood. However, if you already have a worker there, instead of gaining 1 wood, you gain 1 wood plus, I believe this is a plus. Actually, so if I place 1 worker here, I'm getting 1 wood plus the number of workers I have there. So 2 wood total. If I place another worker there on a future turn, and I still have my previous worker on this action space, I gain 1 wood plus 2 wood because I have 2 workers there. So every time you place a worker on an action, that action is getting better and better. There are ways in Architects, this is the tension that comes from the game and from other players, there are ways to kind of capture all of the workers on a location, which reduces the value right back down. It resets the value for placing a worker there. But while it lasts, it feels so good. Like how much longer do I focus on placing workers on this location? And the tension there is because the more you do that, the more lucrative you make that action for another player to capture all the workers there and send them to the jail. So it's a really nice tension of like, what is the tipping point there of how many workers makes it too lucrative for another player to not capture on their turn versus just going after like one more benefit, because you can get so many wood, so many resources from these actions, the wood, the stone, the brick. Yeah, it feels really good to maximize those actions. Even as I'm talking about this game isn't on my list, but in the game Raw, there's a kind of a push your luck element to how long each round will last. It isn't on my list. I don't know if that completely counts as a tipping point, but it does feel like that, where you don't know, there's an uncertainty of how long the round will last. And so you're deciding, how much longer do I wait to get more and more options of tiles in this game before I actually bid on the auction. That's Raw. That is an architect, but it actually does segue into my fourth pick, Forest Shuffle. This is a game that I really, really love. I just played the other day on Board Game Arena, actually, and I was definitely experiencing this tension about when the game will end related to Raw, because in Forest Shuffle, you don't know exactly when the game will end. And so once you start to see some of these winter cards that show up in the deck, the third winter card ends the game immediately. They're in the bottom third of the deck, but you don't know exactly where they appear in that bottom third. But once you get to one winter card or even two winter cards, I have to start to ask myself, like, how much longer can I continue to build up towards certain goals? Like in the game that I had, I was trying to complete trees. I was trying to completely surround trees with 4 different critters and flora and fauna. And so I was deciding, do I want to continue to focus on this goal with cards that are worth a lot if I build up to these cards, or do I just play the easiest card possible to fill up this tree to get the points from filling up this tree? And that tension, that decision point, that tipping point was there because I didn't know how much longer I had in the game. The game isn't a certain number of rounds, and so you don't know when it will end once you get to that second winter card. It's excruciating when you're experiencing it, but it was a great source of tension in the game. I really had to. It led to a lot of really tough decisions in the latter, I don't know, 10%, 20% of the game as to whether or not I wanted to play an easy card or build up to a better card, but I knew that would take multiple turns to build up to, and I didn't know if I actually had multiple turns left in the game. That is the pivotal tipping point tension in Forest Shuffle that I really love. But I'm seeing here that a lot of these pivotal moments are coming from tension with other players, and that is the case in my number 3 pick, Ticket to Ride. So in Ticket to Ride, you are acquiring from this card row, you're acquiring train cards, and you're deciding when on your turn, instead of gaining train cards, that you actually want to spend train cards to complete a route. And the decision there is, am I going to spend 1 blue card to just place 1 train here? It's not worth many points, but it might be a critical connection point between me and some other routes that I need for my routes. You can see this player's routes in hand here, or just because I need to get someplace else. Versus, do I build up a bunch of blue cards and go after a longer route like this? So this is one of these games where you're building up and then paying off throughout the game. Do I just play the easy one? Do I pay for a short route, or do I build up a bunch of cards in one color and then have a big point turn and a big connection too that might help me in a different way in the game? But the tension there is that you don't know when another player will go after the same route. You can kind of get a rough idea of where other players are on the board, but you don't know what's important to them because the goals are secret. And so these longer routes often only have one path. You can see there's only one path here, whereas the shorter routes, there's 2 options here. So the game leaves some great tension here in that, actually some longer routes, I guess they do have 2 options, but not all of them. There's only one option right here. So do you go after it and hope that another player doesn't gain it or doesn't care about it? Or do you just go after the easy route or hold off on the easy route because you know there's 2 options there for 2 players to gain? I really love this element of building up in Ticket to Ride. It feels really good when you build up to a big turn, but it also feels pretty good. The small turns also feel pretty good in Ticket to Ride when you feel like you grab something at the right time when another player may have needed it or gone after it later. That's Ticket to Ride at number 3 on my list. At number 2, a game that I talk about all the time. I don't hear it talked about all that often, but this is Fantastic Factories. So this is a game about building an engine of cards that you're using to spend dice on these cards to gain resources, but also convert things into points. All the cards are worth points, and so you are trying to build up resources to play cards to gain points from the cards. This is one of the ways that you can win the game for sure, to get points in the cards. But also there are cards like this, the nuclear plant. This one says if I use the 6 die here, place the 6 die, I gain 1 energy, but I also gain a point token. And so early on in the game of Fantastic Factories, it may not be great to play or use this card because you're really only getting 1 energy out of a die that could be used for something bigger. But you're getting that point. So you could get incremental points throughout the game by using this. But in the second half of the game or whenever you determine the tipping point to be in a game of Fantastic Factories, these points can be worth a lot. Like you want to be using and activating this card every turn. And it might even take resources to invest in turning a die into a 6 just so you can use it. So Fantastic Factories is a wonderful game about deciding which cards to not only play, but also which cards to activate during the game to either convert dice into points or convert dice into resources that you can spend to play more cards or get points later in the game. That is the great tipping point, the ongoing choice that you have in Fantastic Factories that does lead to a pivotal moment in the game where you're like, okay, I just need to focus on points at this point. But it does have some of those smaller moments throughout the game where you are building up to a certain card that is worth a payoff. Like if I build up to the monolith here, heavy on the resources, but worth 3 points if I actually play it. So I had to build up to actually play this card and have the payoff of playing the monolith. That is Fantastic Factories at number 2. My number 1 pick is a newer game, First in Flight. And this game, I think, is almost built around the idea of building up to a pivotal tipping point in the game. And you get to do it several times in the game, but it feels momentous whenever you do it. So in First in Flight, you are acquiring different resources and different engine building elements to craft a deck of cards that you only use when you go on a test flight. And the flight in the game is really the big moment of the game where you try to test out your airplane to see how it flies. And typically early in the game, it's good to do this early in the game because you get to discover things in your deck that just aren't working well. There are no cards like that shown here, but there are cards in your deck that will impede you from flying, and you need to repair those cards or improve those cards, get them out of your deck essentially, so that you can fly better next time. But you're also adding cards to your deck and building it up. But early on in the game, it's still good to take one of these flights. You're building up to a flight and going on the flight so that you can make the next flight better. But you're constantly crafting this deck and improving your engine, improving the other elements of the game, so that you can go on a flight that I believe, what is the maximum length? You're trying to get to a flight that is, I'm going to say 42. I don't know if that's exactly correct. And this is the prototype, so I don't know if this is actually correct. On this board, it's 36. It might be a little bit longer on the final board, but you're trying to get to a deck where all the numbers on those cards, you can see this flight here, add up to at least 36. That is the win condition in the game if you can get up to that point. Or whatever this number is. It's around 36. It might be a little bit higher in the final version or depending on player count. But I really love in this game that you're building up to these flights and going on multiple flights throughout the game. Every one of these flights feels huge and really, really important, even though you're doing it multiple times. But yeah, I think First in Flight really, really exemplifies this idea of building up and then almost seeing how it pays out, because you don't exactly know. You get to decide in First in Flight when your flight is going to end. That is your decision during the flight, but you don't really know till you go on the flight how you'll do until you actually see the cards come up during the flight. So yeah, First in Flight I think is a wonderful game about building up to that tipping point and seeing exactly how it pays off. There are many other examples of this that I'm sure you can think of that I didn't think of. This isn't an easy category to search for on Board Game Geek. So I'd love to hear your thoughts. What are your favorite games where you build up to something and then there's a payoff? And I want to think about this more than just acquiring resources to either complete a mission or to pay for something. That is important, but that's an important part of games. I don't want to diminish that in any way. But specifically here, I'm talking about these pivotal tipping points where it's really a decision in the game of when do I want to go after the payoff versus the engine or the progression of the game. Where is that decision point in the game? Does it happen a few times throughout the game? Does it happen at one big time in the final third of the game? What are games like that have that great decision space of when do I choose to have this? When do I choose to switch from building up to the payoff itself? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks.